Universal basic income. This is an idea that I've been really interested in after hearing Andrew Yang, who's running for president, is popularizing this idea. That's how I really first heard of it, but it's not a new idea. People have been talking about this for a long time. So I guess the question that I have is, in order to support life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for more Americans, and given our nation's immense wealth, $100 trillion or so, and given how unequal that wealth is distributed currently, why not universal basic income? So for this, I listened to an interesting podcast. This is the Jacobin Radio. This is actually the first time I'd heard this show, but it was an interesting discussion. And here they're focusing on the problems with UBI. So let's listen together, and I have some commentary in reaction to this.
And that's the end of my nation. A cold regard to polemic. Okay, now for a skeptical look at the Universal Basic Income, or UBI. The underlying concept of the UBI is simple. The government pays everyone a certain amount a year without conditions. You don't have to be poor or disabled or old or young. You just get the check regardless. And what about other forms of support, from Silicon Valley billionaires to zero-work communists? Complications arise as soon as you get beyond the basic definition. How large should the UBI be? Enough to allow people to live half decently without working, or a sub-poverty stipend? What about other forms of benefits? Should the UBI replace them or supplement them? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, a Paris-based official think tank sponsored mostly by the world's richest countries, ran some numbers last year looking at over 20 countries, and what they came up with is troubling to supporters of the UBI. The OECD played with the idea of consolidating all current benefit programs into a single cash payment, what would, in the jargon of economics, be a budget-neutral program. The resulting UBI would be quite small, ranging from half the poverty line in Luxembourg to under 10% in Japan and Turkey. It would be about 20% of the poverty line in the US, currently about $12,500 for an individual and $20,000 for a family of three. Although UBI payments to middle and upper income recipients can be taxed away, it's clear that anything like a decent benefit would be very expensive. And in most countries, existing beneficiaries of social spending, the unemployed, the disabled, would be worse off than they are now if those programs were abolished to fund the UBI. So as appealing as the UBI might sound, there are severe complications in transforming it from fantasy to reality.
So to be clear, I would not do away with all other social programs. In fact, the version of UBI that I would support would not change the structure of our government that much. We would look to cut the fat. And I think we could assume that once something like this is instituted, we wouldn't have to depend so much on funding other social programs. But let's assume that we're going to keep everything else the same. And we have to keep in mind here, the whole point of this is, especially for kids, we want all American kids to have an honest opportunity to pursue happiness and have life and liberty. And given the disparities that we have in wealth, I know some people will make the argument that there's no difference in the opportunities that rich kids get versus poor kids. But I don't know how you could argue for that. It's so clear. So I'm not going to even try to argue that at the moment. Let's go on. And, well, I guess one more point on this. We will have to set a limit. So this isn't going to necessarily give everybody a universal basic income is not going to be supportive to the point where everybody is going to be, that nobody is going to have to work and everybody's going to have a yacht. I mean, obviously, right? it's going to be still very, very subsistence way of life for a lot of people. But if you look at what people have now, and then you give them $12,000 a year, that's huge for half of Americans. That $12,000 a year will enable them to do so much more. It will free up so much more of their especially the mental stress. So one counter argument to UBI, anything related to, oh, well, you're just going to be supporting people who aren't working and they're going to make bad decisions with the money that they get. And yes, people are going to make bad decisions. They're still going to waste. Some people are still going to waste the money and make it go towards, things that are not going to support them and their family. But that happens already. And at least, so the part of the type of UBI that I would support is that as soon as you're born, you start getting these payments, and it's the same for everybody. So at the very least, the kids are going to be supported. So even if the parents fuck up, the kids are going to be okay. By the time they're 14 or so, they can start to get access to some of these funds, and at least they'll be all set. That's the idea. And yeah, you're going to have to cut it off. I would say that, well, first of all, I'm not going to just go from like 1 year we're not doing UBI to the next year we're giving everybody $12,000 a year. It wouldn't happen that way. It would be rolled out gradually, because it will be a change. And I'm really not for like these huge sweeping changes, sudden changes. That's not a good idea. We're going to roll this in, and eventually, assuming that there's no inflation, the rates stay the same, or the value of the dollar stays the same, it would be, this would be between $5,000 and $20,000, somewhere in there. But that's huge for a lot of people. We'll go on.
If we can see this disappearing, and this is a way to keep people alive. And the support across the political spectrum is said to be a selling point. You, however, are not a fan. What is your critique of it?
Perhaps let's look at the Ontario model that's now being experimented with, because it's kind of a checklist of how a system that is called basic income could be used to advance what we might call the neoliberal agenda. So what is being provided is an income that is higher than people see presently on social assistance in Ontario, but it's still a sub-poverty income. So it's not going to be an income that would enable people to withdraw from the labour market if they chose to, or survive the robot future. It's a low payment. It's going to be provided primarily to people who are waged, but still living on very low income. So it's designed primarily as a wage top-up, which is another way of saying a subsidy to low-paying employers.
That's an interesting thought, and a real concern of a program like this. Now, that Ontario model is different because it's sort of like the earned income tax credit that we have in the United States. But it's only for people who have a job. So this is different. This is for everybody. UBI is for everybody, or at least the form that I would support. But still, with the UBI, you call into question wages, and would this be a subsidy for companies that are providing only low wage jobs? And you also have to look at then what is the role of the minimum wage, and what should that be? And there's a lot of debate about the $15 minimum wage. I have critiques of that. So this is something that you would have to work through, no doubt about it. And I don't have necessarily a great response to that, but I still think that in general, This is going to be something that will be saving money, and it will be enabling people it will be empowering the workers.
Conditions placed upon their assistants, they can make those choices themselves. So the welfare state is seen as intrusive and heavy-handed. What do you say to that kind of that argument?
Well, of course, there's absolutely no doubt that existing systems of income support are rooted in the tradition of the English poor laws, and they are indeed intrusive, and they are indeed sub-poverty and inadequate. And we as an organisation challenge that on an ongoing basis and demand an end to bureaucratic intrusion, and we fight for adequate income. But we don't think that basic income, as it is likely to emerge in this present political neoliberal context, is going to be what the left libertarians want it to be. It's going to be designed by the architects of the neoliberal agenda. It's going to suit the interests of the Silicon Valley crowd. It's not going to be based on people's wishes. It's going to be based on an existing political reality.
Good point. But UBI is a great distance from being implemented on a broad scale. And I think this speaks to another issue, which is campaign finance. And I think it's true that we will never have the type of UBI that we would want, or any of the programs that we want, if we don't have campaign finance reform. Because, right now, the largest companies, the wealthiest individuals in this highly, highly stratified society that we live in, these are the people that have a seat at the table. They can buy their seat at the table. If you don't have the money, you ain't playing. You're not at the table. So until we change that system, which we can, there are tangible steps that we can take to change that, and I'll probably be discussing that soon. But that's actually got to happen first, because we'll never have the kind of transformative programming like the style of UBI that I'm interested in. We won't have that without campaign finance reform.
So it would be a step backward from the status quo.
Yes, precisely. And I mean, most disastrously of all, if you now arrive at a situation where you have reconciled yourself to the notion that low-wage, precarious work is an inevitability, and all you can do is steer some tax money in the direction of people working for poverty wages, I think that's a disastrous strategy, particularly at a time when internationally so much exciting happening in terms of challenging low-wage, precarious work. You have the Flight to 15, you have a challenge to inadequate minimum wages across North America. You have McDonald's workers in the UK taking up struggles, Amazon workers in various parts of Europe. The alleged inevitability of low-wage, precarious work is being resisted. Rather than provide a cash payment out of the general tax revenues, the issue is to fight for decent wages.
Now, what about the issue of the robots taking over? I'm skeptical of that myself, but that's a very...
So the way he was framing why somebody would want to go for UBI, that's looking at it in an apathetic way, which is not the way that I'm looking at it. I'm interested in it as a way to provide people support in the hardest of times and to get them over the hump so that they don't fall into the cracks, especially kids. And because it happens where if you become incarcerated because you steal something, because you don't have money to pay for your child's food and a means for transportation or whatever it is. This is all too common in the United States. People don't have a couple of dollars to put together to support their children in the most basic ways, and then they get themselves in a situation that they can't crawl out of. So that's where it's coming from. One more segment we'll listen to.
Remains a fantasy.
I'm speaking with John Clark of the Ontario Campaign Against Poverty. The OECD a while back did the math on basic income, comparing how much it would cost versus the existing welfare state. And I think it was 2 or 3 European countries they looked at. And the message is, regardless of what you think of their numbers precisely, the message is, which I think is kind of hard to argue with, to have a basic income at a civilized level would be very, very, very expensive. And really the only way to make it affordable would be to have it be very low and eliminate all the other welfare programs. I mean, is there anything wrong with that math?
No, I think the OECD report was probably quite correct. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives here has done a similar kind of a breakdown of things, and actually suggests very interestingly that for about half the cost of providing a basic income that would only have a goal of lifting people out of poverty who are in poverty, not really a universal program, but for about half the cost of that, you could introduce $15 billion worth of major changes that would sweepingly provide social housing, that would provide dental care, that would provide pharma care, universal child care. So yes, a truly adequate basic income would be enormously expensive. The OECD has said it.
So this gets to pretty much the heart of the question, which is what programs are best run at what levels to support a higher standard of living for all people in a nation, and who decides what's worth doing. What I observe where we have people who are really struggling in this country, part of how they get in that situation is because they can't represent themselves. They'd have no power. They have no money to make decisions, so they can't be active in their communities, they can't support their families, and they certainly can't advocate for themselves on a federal level. So the idea of UBI is that for more basic decisions that they have to make, that people have to make in their lives, we're giving them the choice. We're empowering them. And it's not, again, we're not giving them yachts. We're not giving them, this is really, really basic. But again, for so many people in this country, it will go so far in enabling them to pursue their dreams and to make a life for themselves and to be more autonomous. So, but at the same time, there are programs that do run better at a federal level. There's some things that run better at a federal level. There's some things that run better at a state level. Some things that better are run at a municipal level, where you pull in the resources together, you're taxing so that the resources are pulled together and you can organize this at that level. And then there are other decisions that are probably best made by individuals and by families. So right now we have so many people in this country that they have no decisions. They have no decision-making power. This would give them at least enough power to make decisions in order to fulfill their own basic needs. And the other point to this is how expensive it is. And yeah, it's we're talking about, so if you gave everybody $12,000 a year in the United States, that would be about $4.5 trillion, $5 trillion. A lot of money, right? But let's not forget that the wealth of the United States is around 100 trillion. Currently, our federal spending is 4 trillion. So even if you change nothing else, you would have, and you instituted this UBI, it would be $8.5 trillion per year. You would double the budget. Seems pretty far-fetched, right? But, and it's true that you can't fund this if you're taxing income. The way we do income taxes now, there's no way you would generate enough money, because you would just bankrupt people who are middle class and upper middle class. But if you change to taxing wealth, you could easily do this, and you would do it in a way that it really wouldn't disturb the markets very much at all, and it wouldn't bankrupt or really put an overwhelming burden on anybody. Now, I talk about how I would structure this in my previous video, which is taxing wealth for prosperity and equity. So you got to go check that out, because I explain how you would pay for this, and you'd be amazed to see that actually the majority of Americans are going to be paying 1% or less of their wealth in taxes every year. So they would be paying significantly less than they currently pay in taxes. And yet we can still have a surplus, so we can support programs like UBI and further increase the standard of living for most Americans, which a lot of progress was made in the 20th century. I feel like that progress has stagnated significantly, while the whole wealth of the country has increased massively. So how do we reconcile this? What can we do to boost it up a little bit better to continue to make progress? Because I'm not satisfied with just staying where we are. So we made progress 50 years ago. Great. I want to make progress in my lifetime too. One of the programs that could potentially do this is UBI. And based on this critique of it, I'm not convinced any more than I was before I heard it that this is a bad idea. UBI seems like a really good idea, and some form of it should be instituted in the coming decades.